Hello, welcome to this podcast, which is one of a series of podcasts by Slokat titled Tough Questions, Smart Answers on All Things Transport, People, and Planet. Through this podcast, we hope to bridge voices across generations of changemakers over critical issues in sustainable low carbon transport. My name is Douanla Marc Jonathan, based in Paris. I am a Slokat VRF Young Leader in Sustainable Transport. This episode is titled En Road to Low Carbon, Sustainable and Resilient Freight Transport and Logistics. We are honored to have Dr. Jan Hoffmann, who is Chief Trade Logistics Branch and Division on Technology and Logistics of the United Nations Trade and Development, UNCTAD. Welcome, Jan. We are happy to have you today in order to hear your insights on what it takes to accelerate the transformation of freight transport and logistics and to learn how our economies and societies can tackle climate change while staying competitive, equitable, and resilient.
Good. Thank you for the invite. Thank you for having me and always very happy to collaborate with Slowcut, who have been our partners, or we have been partners together for quite some time, working on these topics. And you also joined us in Barbados at our Global Supply Chain Forum, where we launched the manifesto, which is something I think you can be particularly proud of. And we were proud that we could launch this during our forum. So yes, thank you for having us here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan. The pleasure is fully shared. So, as we know, the transport sector had the highest increase in global emissions with 18% growth from 2010 to 2019, thereby being the laggard among sectors. And in the meantime, freight transport emissions comprise a rising share, accounting for 42% of global transport CO2 emissions in 2019. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical tensions, energy supply pressures, inflation, increased volatility of shipping costs, and extreme climate events are revealing the increased vulnerability of freight systems and their workforces and how this impacts on food security and on the capacities for emergency response and economic recovery of countries. And this leads to our first question, Jan. At a time like this, where global supply chains are faced with the polycrisis of multifaceted challenges, what are the responses necessary to navigate these obstacles and ensure a resilient global supply chain?
Yeah, easier said than done. On the numbers you just shared, the global increase in transport emissions, we had assessed this specifically for the maritime part, and I must say most of what I will share with you and my thinking is based on our analysis of the maritime transport, which moves about 80% of the volume of international freight. So for the maritime transport, in our last review of maritime transport, we found data that is in line with what you just presented. In spite of all the efforts to reduce emissions, actually emissions over the 10 years from 2012 to 2022 increased by more than 20%. And this was really bad news. On the positive side, trade has actually grown even more, which in our view is good. We believe it's positive to have a trade-driven development. So as trade grew even more, you can also say, well, the emissions per ton of trade or per ton of mile, they have actually gone down. So that is the good news. But now I'm afraid I have to spoil the good news again, because our research also found that half of the improvement of the reduction of emissions per ton of cargo or per ton mile, half of that improvement was due to economies of scale, of ships getting bigger and bigger. So on the sea side, this saves emissions, energy. Already Adam Smith and Alfred Marshall in their early economics book, they used actually shipping as an example of economies of scale. Now you double the volume, but you only increase the energy you need by, I think, the square root of 2 or something. But it's clearly an example. But that does not mean that we are fans of big ships, which would be another long discussion here, the impacts on the total door-to-door logistics cost on markets, on peak demand in the ports. But we have to acknowledge that there has been some improvement. But if we now want to continue the improvement, at some point in time, well, ships cannot get even bigger. We have to actually do something different, more operational improvement. And in the end, ultimately we need to use alternative fuels. And in that sense, if I shared this a bit as a response to your introductory remarks, so your question about the current supply chain challenges issues, it's fascinating. Well, you think you learned something, you understood what happened during COVID, and then comes another crisis, which is not quite the same. During COVID, we saw a real bad news surge in freight rates and costs, which had an impact on inflation, especially on the small island developing states. And I think we discussed this a little later, the SIDS. So when you look at the causes for the problems during COVID, an important part there was the logistics problems in the ports and hinterland. So ships spent 20% longer in ports than before COVID. This reduced the effective capacity, and this demand supply, you mentioned what we learned in microeconomics, the demand curve, the supply curve is very steep. So this reduction of supply capacity was a core component, core explanation of the surge in freight rates. What do we see today? Today, we also have actually a similar situation. It has not been that much in the news yet, but the freight rates are again surging horribly. I mean, very high. They are already today, the container spot rates, at 2/3 of the peak during the COVID. So they are again much higher than they were ever before COVID. And the underlying reason is somewhat similar because, again, we have a shortage of capacity. But this time it is not that the ships spent more time in the port, but this time it is because the ships spent more time at sea because of the Red Sea crisis. So I find it fascinating. I hope I can transmit this here in a podcast. Normally, I would like to have a PowerPoint where I can show demand and supply curves or maps with ships going around South Africa, but I hope the listeners can imagine this. So during COVID, we had a surge in freight rates because demand went up, but also the supply went down because ships spent time in port. Today, we have demand, normal, growing, but the supply actually went down because ships have to go longer distance. And at least at the beginning, and still a bit today, to compensate for the longer distance, ships are also going faster. And again, the combination of longer distance and going faster leads to a continued increase in emissions. We don't have the data yet, the annual compilation, the measured data, but it is definitely bad news that emissions continue. So the negative impact of the supply chain crisis, which was your question, well, you also asked what we can do about it. And if I just keep talking and thinking aloud here, so what can we do about it? Overall, the transport providers, the importers, exporters, the companies, the more we can depend on a larger number of different suppliers. That is generally the idea. You don't want that deep supply chains, like a supplier into a supplier, like a chip that goes into a component that goes into a bit and another piece. So you have up to 9 deep supply chains, 9 levels. So while there's really no easy solution, but the individual players, the actors, I am a company, I am a shop, I'm a producer, I'm a shipping company. The more I can try and depend on more different companies, a wider geographic area, more different goods, substitutes, different transport providers, different routes, the less I will be impacted if all of a sudden there's a big change. And there has been talk about nearshoring, like with costs going up and depending less on far away. In fact, what we observe is the opposite. Distance is actually going up for all main cargo. So we don't have any nearshoring. What we do see, and I really have to thank my UNCTAD colleagues from the trade division here, they have done a very nice work looking at friendshoring. So if you analyze who votes with whom in the United Nations Security Council, you really see who are friends objectively. Like you and I may have different opinions, who are friends, who are not friends, but who votes together, a little bit like what Huntington did for his book, The Clash of Civilizations. So the UNCTAD did find out that the trade among friends is increasing more than trade as a whole. Yeah, this is not nearshoring, but it is some beginning of friend shoring, which I find quite fascinating, and it's part of the wide area of what can we do to reduce our dependency on a small number of specific suppliers, how to diversify, how to, yeah, I better stop here because I could go on and talk about Panama and Black Sea and Red Sea and other things, but I hope I have given some thoughts in response to your first question.
Thank you very much, Jan. Can't agree more. Can't agree less. Yeah, and as you have said, I find it really fascinating. And I was at the International Transport Forum, and one of my best quotes which was from the Minister of Transport of Lithuania, which was the acting president here of the ITF Forum, was every conflict disruption gives us certain lessons that we need to have alternatives in the transportation system. And I think you've kind of mentioned that in your in what you've said previously. So yeah.
And if I can just as a follow up on this, and you're absolutely right there. So what we see currently is unfortunately a combination of crises. There's still the Black Sea crisis, which reduces options for especially some dry bulk cargo, but the combination of less de facto capacity of the Suez Canal, because carriers are afraid of going through the Suez Canal, and the de facto reduced capacity of the Panama Canal, which is, I mean, difficult to really pinpoint, but overall, our assumption and belief is it has to do with climate change. Yeah, there's less water available. There's also more need for water with the expanded canal and so on. But overall, the number of transits of ships that have gone through the canal has gone down. And this, then the combination really leads to fewer options for the shippers. If I want to go from China to New York, in the past, I had 3 options. I could go through the Suez Canal and maybe combine the shipping route with a stop over the Mediterranean or even in Northern Europe, Singapore, Sri Lanka. So that's a somewhat longer route, but not much longer. Or I would cross the big Pacific Ocean, go through the Panama Canal and go to New York. That's option number 2. And the third option is I go with my container ship up to Los Angeles or Long Beach, and then I use the so-called land bridge. So you had 3 competing options, and they helped reduce prices because there's choice, there's competition. Currently, 2 of these 3 options are severely limited. So we actually have data that shows that the traffic that uses the land bridge is going up, and prices, freight rates between China and Los Angeles have also gone up. And in the end, some alternative could still be go around South Africa. So there you have longer distance and more emissions on the seaside. Or you go to Los Angeles and you actually go a little shorter distance. But the land transport is less energy efficient than the all-water route. So again, we have more emissions. No? So again, I think it's a fascinating example where these logistics problems are linked to higher prices, to economic difficulties, less trade, higher trade costs, and less sustainable transport systems.
Yeah, exactly. And we've equally seen that these frequent extreme weather events and there are both challenges that we have all mentioned. They inflict huge financial losses through direct damage to freight transport assets and to a greater extent through freight transport disruptions. Furthermore, some countries are more vulnerable to these challenges, such as small island developing states, landlocked developing countries, and least developed countries. In light of this, as you earlier mentioned in the beginning, recently from the 21st of May to the 24th, UNCTAD and the government of Barbados organized the first United Nations Global Supply Chain Forum in order to advance the global dialogue on trade and development and identify concrete actions and recommendations regarding resilience, climate change, connectivity, digitalization, and inclusiveness of vulnerable country groups. More so, a manifesto for intermodal, low carbon efficient, and resilient freight transport and logistics was co-initiated by SLOCAT and the Kuhn Foundation together with other partners. And this was launched, as you rightly said, during the Global Supply Chain Forum. We invite everyone to have a look at the manifesto. Hence, we would like to know, Jam, vulnerable countries like small island developing states are the worst affected victims amidst climate disasters and their other challenges. How can resilient freight transport and logistics help mitigate their vulnerability?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And if I may again get one step back to give some background data and information, we have done really a lot of hard data research on what explains transport costs, especially maritime transport costs. No? And each one I could now present a lot of detail, but there are 6 main determinants, we call it in econometric studies, what explains why some countries pay more than others. First, there's distance. Second, there's economies of scale. Third, there's competition. More competition leads to lower prices. Fourth, there are imbalances. If you have to go full one way and got empty the other direction, total costs go up. There's a type, and what type of goods? Is it reefer, value of goods? And sixth, and last but not least, is of course the port infrastructure and services, the customs, the trade station, the infrastructure. So on all 6 of these determinants, unfortunately, small island developing states tend to be on the losing end. Yeah, many SIDS are further away. Not all, but many are further away. By definition, the S in SIDS is the small. There's diseconomies of scale. Yeah? That is linked to less competition. Very often they have only one port. It's difficult to privatize a monopoly. So it's really difficult on the port side, on the shipping side. Imbalances. There's no wider hinterland. So you import containerized and maybe export tourism services. It's very imbalanced. And then of course the lack of infrastructure of port services. So there are some areas where we cannot do much. The distance, I mean, we cannot move the islands. It's a bit difficult. There are some things that can be done through transparency to shipping markets, global regulation, to have at least transparency and competition. But the main area where we can do something is in the ports and the digital solutions and the efficiency and the infrastructure. Right. It doesn't solve the whole thing, but if you look now, if you link this now to the climate change discussions, many SIDS, especially many SIDS in the Pacific, I must say, have been really very positively, very constructively engaged at the negotiations at the International Maritime Organization. I really want to thank them, congratulate them, because they have understood in shipping, it is very difficult. I won't say impossible, but it's very difficult to have exceptions or different markets. In other industries, you could say in cement production or beer breweries or whatever, you may say some countries under the Paris Agreement, okay, I give you a little more time. You can decarbonize a little later, a little less. In shipping, this doesn't work. Everybody, I mean, ships go all around and it's the same ships and the same fuel. So overall, there's an agreement. We have to have a multilateral agreement. So what do we do now with those who are more negatively affected by, for example, higher freight rates? Because if we decarbonize shipping, let us not cheat ourselves, we don't yet have the exact numbers, but there's no doubt from the literature, from previous impact assessments done by UNCTAD, that the shipping costs will go up. Yeah, and SIDS already pay more than any other country group. Yeah, I mean, we have latest data now, a new transport cost data set with the collaboration with the World Bank and UNCTAD. Very great data set. We are very proud of it. It confirms that in maritime transport, importing freight rates are highest for CITs among main country groups. So they already pay more. If now freight rates go up, CITs will also be more negatively impacted because they depend more on maritime transport and they already pay more. So if it now go up, they will be more negatively affected. And one could have expected that maybe some CITs then say, no, I don't want it. I don't want to increase my costs. I'm already negatively impacted. But the CITs have understood that, well, they would be among the first to be negatively affected by climate change. So they see we must do something, including in maritime transport, which contributes to about 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the several countries, Marshall Islands among them, have been, in my opinion, very positively, constructively saying, yes, we do want to decarbonize maritime transport. However, and there we are with them logically, if there's an economic measure, let's call it a levy. I mean, we are not allowed to call it a tax, so we don't call it a tax, but call it economic measure. It used to be called market-based measure, but having an economic measure that makes traditional fuels more expensive and at the same time makes alternative fuels more competitive, it will achieve two things. First, it will advance the energy transition, make it faster, because there's an economic incentive to use alternative fuels and to invest in ships, in port facilities, in energy distribution, in bunkering for the alternative fuels. So the economic incentive is there, and the good thing there is it does not prescribe any specific solution or fuel. It would just say, dear private sector, we don't know the technology of the future yet. We don't know the operations, the shipping networks, the demand. So it will be the private sector that will benefit. So that's one advantage of an economic measure. The other is that it can generate the funding or some of the funding that we can then use and invest in the CITs. So make it really, again, simple. We cannot exclude CITs. We cannot say, oh, you do not need to decarbonize. Not possible. But then there must be something, because they are more negatively affected. They did not cause climate change. We need their votes to agree on an ambitious goal at the IMO. So in a way, we have to say, okay, we will help you. We will help you comply with future IMO regulations, investing in the alternative fuels and their usage and maybe their provision as providers or bunkering. But also, if shipping costs go up because of the more expensive, less energy dense alternative fuels, shipping costs will go up. We must help the CITs and least developed countries and other smaller vulnerable to invest in their ports and reduce shipping costs through other means. So the shipping costs on the ship side with the fuel, it will increase, but I can help reduce total shipping costs by investing in new cranes, in new digital solutions, in climate smart trade facilitation, in climate change adaptation in seaports, make that the next time the hurricane in St. Lucia, not all container cranes fall down. I mean, so that is really the logic here. CITs do pay more for the reasons that I explained. They will also be even more negatively affected if freight rates go up. I sincerely don't see any other way than an economic measure that helps mitigate the negative impact of climate change mitigation. See what I mitigate the negative impact of mitigation. I reduce the negative impact of the higher freight costs.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. That's very well understood. And I hope you had a great time and enjoyed your stay in Barbados.
Yes.
In the meantime,
We
I would
missed
like
you
to.
there. You
Yeah,
went, and we have coordinated with the International Transport Forum that never again will we have our 2 meetings at the same time. That was really we tried, we spoke, we coordinated, and somehow, yeah, it could not be avoided on this occasion. But for the next Global Supply Chain Forum in 2 years in Saudi Arabia, we will guarantee that the International Transport Forum and the UNCTAD Global Supply Chain Forum will not take place at the same time, and we will work together.
I'm happy to hear that. I'm happy to hear that. So I would like to know to end up, what are your key takeaways from the Global Supply Chain Forum, and how can the forum's legacy help break
Mm,
bottlenecks and foster low carbon, sustainable, and resilient freight transport and logistics worldwide?
yeah, yeah. No, we were really, really very, very happy and proud how this turned out. And I have to again thank the government of Barbados for forcing us to do it, and then also for hosting us, for collaborating. We started about 2 years ago with an empty sheet of white paper and no budget and no nothing. And in the end, we're overwhelmed by the response. It is, I have to say, I think it does reflect UNCTAD's convening power. Yeah, we are well connected, and we have to thank all the partners, including SlowCut. But we were 100 partners. I don't want to start listing specific ones, but we had 100 partners there who jointly organized 60 sessions on a wide range of topics. We started planning thinking if we are lucky, we have 150 in-person participants. In the end, we had more than 1,000 in-person participants. No? So it was really big. And this in itself is already an outcome. So we like to say it was not a one-off forum, but we have started not a one movie, a blockbuster, we have started a Netflix series. And we already have thank you, the Mavani, the Port Authority of Saudi Arabia. They have agreed to host the next one. They've also supported us for Barbados. So for me, that's already one outcome that confirms this topic will remain on the agenda with many important partners. The areas, the topics we covered, and we are still working on our 150-page summary report, but the areas where we worked on maritime transport and ports, of course, was very strong. They're including the decarbonization, of course, but also shipping networks, connectivity, and so on. Digitalization and innovation was another topic very much on the agenda, and also with growing needs and demand. We had an innovation challenge, which was one of the outcomes. Trade facilitation, we had in parallel a forum for national trade facilitation committees, and we are planning to do this from now on again every 2 years together with the Global Supply Chain Forum. We had private sector participation, large company, smaller company. We looked at inclusivity, gender issues, smaller companies, a lot of cross-cutting issues. And then this year was, of course, very much on SITS. Barbados as a SITS itself, they had proposed this, and we happily agreed. So we made a special effort to also connect SITS from the different oceans. So we were able, with the financial support of several partners, to bring Pacific Island high-level representative ministers to Barbados, who then had a SITS ministerial statement, which was one of the outcomes. So among the outcomes, yes, we launched this World Bank UNCTAD data set I mentioned. We also we consider the manifesto that you presented as one of our outcomes. It's a bit like cheeky that we take your manifesto as one of our outcomes, but we appreciate that, and we think we could help by getting the momentum and the stakeholders towards the manifesto. And I don't know where to continue. Stop. I'm probably speaking already too much. You asked a short question about what were the main outcomes. Again, for me, the main outcome is that we brought together different stakeholders from different angles: private sector, public sector, Pacific SITS, Caribbean SITS, different approaches when we look at these decarbonization in maritime. But we also had speakers there from the development banks. We had speakers there linking what is happening at the IMO with with what is happening at COP. So it was really a forum. It was not an UNCTAD conference, but a forum which brought together 100 partners, and we already received complaints from some other agencies who were not there, and why were we not invited? And I have to say this here, so please don't delete this from this podcast. Everybody was invited. We had official notifications to all UNCTAD member states and stakeholders. Nobody could say they were not invited, but next time we will even more proactively reach out. But everybody who listens to this, you are invited to the next Global Supply Chain Forum 2026 in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, John. Well said. So we have reached to the end of this episode, and we really thank you for your contributions and for your resources and insights. And I'll equally ask our dear listeners to stay tuned for other episodes of the podcast series by Slocat. Today it was me, Marc Jonathan from Paris, and Dr. Jan Hoffmann from Geneva. Goodbye from now.